Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me today on episode 77 of Untold Evidence. The quest for the truth never surrenders. Today, our journey starts in November 1983. A Soviet aircraft sat on runways in East Germany, fueled and armed with live nuclear weapons. They were waiting for the orders to fly west. The men in those cockpits believed an American strike was hours away. They were wrong. What they were actually watching was a NATO training exercise. They didn't know that, and for a few days, we were as close to nuclear war as we were at the Cuban Missile Crisis. The exercise they were watching was called Able Archer 83, and the most disturbing part is that the side which nearly triggered the apocalypse, the West, had no idea it was even happening. So today we're going to explore the rehearsal that was very, very close to becoming the real thing. And the now declassified documents tell us a little bit more about it. And we've got to be honest here, historians still disagree. As ever, we label every tier as we go, and we'll end on something that happened just months ago in 2025, which proves this story is still being fought over to this day. So let's start with the year, because 1987 is the key to everything. This was the most dangerous 12 months of the entire Cold War, and almost nobody alive remembers it in that way. In March, President Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. 2 weeks later, he announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, the missile shield that press nicknamed Star Wars. To Moscow, a shield was not defensive. A shield is what you build when you plan to throw the first punch and survive the reply. Very logical. Then, the 1st of September, a Soviet fighter shot down a Korean airline passenger jet, Flight 007, killing all 269 people aboard, including an American congressman. The two superpowers were no longer just rivals. They were two frightened giants, each convinced the other might be about to strike. Now, this is a really interesting scenario because I remember Giorgiani, the great Jason Giorgiani, telling us that the Soviets and the US were in contact in the Cold War because extraterrestrial, trans-dimensional, whatever label we're giving these objects, were flying around nuclear bases on both countries, and each were significantly fearful that it was the other about to launch a nuclear attack. Now, I think that should be held in the background of this conversation as well, because it adds to the fear and confusion of these events when you are not only just fighting the potential other superpower, but something extraterrestrial. It does add a whole different angle. However, for now, let's get back to the story, because the single most important trigger is the one most people have never heard of. In late 1983, the United States began deploying a new missile in Western Europe called the Pershing II. This was not just another missile. From West Germany, a Pershing II could reach Moscow in roughly 6 minutes. 6 minutes is not enough time for a leader to wake up, confirm an attack, and then decide to respond. It's barely enough time to die. So for the Soviet leadership, the Pershing II was a decapitation weapon, a gun held directly against the head of their command structure. That deployment, happening in the very same week as the Able Archer, is the reason Moscow was primed to read a training exercise as the real countdown. And as the Soviets were not merely just nervous, they were running a program built entirely around fear. It was called Ryan, a Russian acronym for the nuclear missile attack, launched in 1981 under the KGB chief and later Soviet leader Yuri Andropov. Ryan was a standing global intelligence operation with one job: watch the West for any sign that a first strike was being prepared. Andropov was a lifelong spy, gravely ill, and convinced that Reagan was capable of launching a surprise attack. Part of the conviction was personal. As a young diplomat, Andropov has been the Soviet ambassador in Hungary during the 1956 uprising and had watched a communist government collapse almost overnight in a sudden explosion of violence. And I don't think that memory ever left him. In fact, it gave him a deep, almost instinctive fear of being caught off guard by a rapid, unexpected change. And it clearly shaped how he read every signal coming from the West after that. Agents in the Western capitals were ordered to count the lights burning at late night in the government buildings, to monitor blood bank donations, to track movements of key officials, even to watch the clergy being moved into position. The Kremlin had quite literally instructed its spies to find the attack it already believed was happening. Now that is tier 1. We have it from the Soviet defectors and from declassified files. So in 1983, something had already shown how thin this thread was. On the 26th of September, just weeks before Able Archer, a Soviet early warning satellite system reported that the United States had launched 5 nuclear missiles. The officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, had minutes to decide whether to pass the warning up the chain, which would likely have triggered the Soviets to launch in response. He judged it as a false alarm, and he was right. We've covered that story before. An amazing story it is. But it was sunlighting that glinted off the clouds, fooling the sensors. And part of what saved everyone was a piece of cold logic on Petrov's part. He reasoned that a genuine American first strike would come as an overwhelming barrage of hundreds of missiles, not a feeble handful of 5. Exceptional logic to avoid potentially catastrophe. A real attack would not tiptoe. And that instinct, that signal looked wrong for what it claimed to be, is maybe the only reason we are here to watch this. The system designed to prevent surprise had nearly started a war by mistake. So when the Able Archer began weeks later, the Soviet machine was already raw, twitchy, and clearly primed to deliver the worst. Now here is where the danger becomes mechanical. When you train an intelligent machine to look for a threat, it's probably going to find a threat, whether it's real or not. And in November 1983, NATO handed this machine exactly the pattern it had been told to fear. Able Archer 83 was a command post exercise, part of a larger annual war game called Autumn Forge. No troops stormed anywhere. It was just a rehearsal run from NATO headquarters of the procedures the alliance would use to move from conventional war all the way up to releasing nuclear weapons. So on paper it's just routine, it happened most years. But this particular run had new features that had never been used before, and every single feature looked to a Soviet analyst like the genuine article. So the communications used new coded formats. There were periods of total radio silence. The exercise moved through escalating alert states all the way to simulated nuclear release. And by some accounts, senior political figures were referenced in the script at the level of seniority the Soviets had never seen in a drill. So to a KGB officer holding the Ryan checklist, this was not a rehearsal. This was a checklist coming true, item by item. The exercise that was meant to simulate the road to nuclear war was, at least to the people watching from the other side, almost indistinguishable from the road to nuclear war. So Moscow reacted as if it was genuine. Soviet fighter bombers in eastern Germany and Poland were placed on alert and loaded with nuclear weapons. According to the later declassified intelligence, at least one squadron loaded weapons configurations it had never actually loaded before. So the Soviet Air Force went to a state of readiness that included preparations for immediate use of nuclear weapons. That was not a posturing for show. The signals intelligence the West later recovered showing real, physical, frightening preparation for war were there. Now, there's a small, telling document from inside the American system that shows somebody understood the dangers of these games, at least in principle. A memo associated with Colin Powell, later among the most senior figures in the United States military, warned that conducting a worldwide nuclear exercise could demonstrate strength of purpose, but could also just as easily be perceived as showing an intent to actually use nuclear weapons. So in other words, the risk that a rehearsal could be misread as the real thing was not some retrospect insight invented by historians. It was understood on paper by serious people at the time, and that the exercise went ahead at full realism anyway. So here is the line that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The West did not notice. To NATO commanders, Able Archer was just a box-ticking exercise on a calendar. The Soviet alert set off no alarm bells in the American warning system. The two sides were standing on a cliff edge and only one of them could see the drop. If the Soviets had decided in those hours that the attack was real and their only hope was to strike before they were destroyed, the West would have not understood what was happening until the missiles were already climbing. What pulled us back was not a system. It was a man, an American Air Force agent named Leonard Perutz, and he was watching the Soviet alert build. Standard procedure would have been to respond in kind, to raise NATO's own readiness to match. Perutz looked at the picture, made a judgment call, and chose to do nothing. He held NATO steady, and by not reacting, he denied the Soviet machine the final confirmation it was hunting for. The exercise simply ended, the Soviets stood down, and the moment passed. Years later, Perutz wrote that he had asked himself what might have happened if he had instead ordered a precautionary build-up of force. Now, we came that close to a feedback loop with no off switch. Two men, Petrov and Perutz, weeks apart, each choosing calm over reaction. This time, we got lucky. So how do we actually know all this? And this is the part that lifts the story from rumour to record. We have it from Oleg Gordievsky, a senior KGB officer stationed in London who was secretly working with the British intelligence. Gordievsky saw the panic from inside and warned the West that Moscow genuinely feared an attack. His warning reached the top, and they are widely credited with the shocking both Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan into softening their rhetoric, which makes one secret agent a quiet hinge of a late Cold War history. We also have it from a 1990 report by the Presidential Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, a body that answers directly to the American president. The report was based on over 75 interviews with the officials who were actually there, and it was finally declassified in 2015 after a Freedom of Information lawsuit. It's absolutely nuts how often we have to go through the full legal structure just to get information. I'm sure I've moaned about, in fact, I know I've moaned about that throughout this channel's history, but it comes up time and time again in almost every video. So its conclusions are not vague. It states that there is little doubt the Soviets were genuinely worried by Able Archer. It states the exercises may have inadvertently placed relations on a hair trigger. I think it did. And it states damningly that the president had been given assessments that understood the risks. The men at the very top were told it was fine. It was not fine. Now, this is where an honest channel has to put the brakes on, because there is a serious counter-argument and we have to hear it. The counter-narrative and real credentialed historians stand on this side. The revisionist case is the danger had been badly overstated, and that Able Archer has grown into a myth far bigger than the facts can support. The argument goes something like this. The Soviet alert was real, but it was limited. It involved specific air units, not the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal. There was no general mobilization, no evacuation of cities, no mass movement of ground forces, the kind you would expect if the Kremlin truly believed the end was hours away. So in this reading, what we saw was a heightened vigilance from a jumpy adversary, not a finger genuinely tightening on the trigger. The revisionists point out that the phrase closest to nuclear war since Cuba is a dramatic claim resting heavily on a small number of sources, including the defector, who had every personal reason to make his warning sound urgent. And they note something genuinely awkward. The single British intelligence report that supposedly details Soviet preparations for war obviously remains classified to this day. So we are partly trusting a conclusion we're not allowed to fully read. How often do we get to this point? So there is more on the skeptic side, and it's not weak. The American intelligence community did not all agree, even at the time, and it did not all agree afterwards. A major United States intelligence estimate produced the following, and it concluded that the Soviet military activity did not in fact indicate that Moscow believed the NATO attack was imminent. In that assessment, the alerts and the loaded aircraft were read as a prudent caution from an anxious advisory, not as a leadership bracing for the apocalypse. Some senior CIA analysts spent years afterwards arguing that the war scare story had been inflated, and that the most alarming interpretation leaned too heavily on a single well-placed defector. When the people with access to the raw intelligence cannot agree on what it meant, we've got to be deeply suspicious of everyone and anyone, and that goes for my interpretation too. And I'm trying to be as clear and concise as possible, but we're clearly missing huge portions of this event. So it's a fair and powerful objection, and I can't just wave that away. The truth almost certainly sits in the uncomfortable middle. It's probably wrong to say the Soviet had decided to launch. It's also clearly wrong to say there was nothing to worry about, because the president's own advisory board, with access to everything in real time, concluded the exact opposite. The honest position is this: we cannot really know how close the Soviet leadership came to a decision, because we cannot read the minds of the men who are no longer with us. What we do know for certain is that every condition for a catastrophic accident was present at the same moment, and that the West was sleepwalking straight through them. You don't need a Soviet order to launch for that to be terrifying. You only need a misunderstanding and a hair trigger. And in November 1983, we had demonstrably both. So where is the tier 3 on all this story? Because we all know we love a bit of tier 3. It barely needs any, and I'm not going to invent some just to make it scarier. The wild fringe claims here are thin, and the documented tier 1 facts are frightening enough. Often the case, but it is worth saying plainly, sometimes the boring institutional truth is the most disturbing thing in the room, and this is the same this time. There is a strange, hopeful footnote to all of this. The scare appears to have genuinely shaken Ronald Reagan. The man who called the Soviets an evil empire in March was within a couple of years sitting across a table from the Soviet leaders negotiating to abolish nuclear weapons entirely. In 1986, he met Mikhail Gorbachev at the Reykjavik, and the two of them became astonishingly close to agreeing to scrap their entire nuclear arsenals. The following year, they'd signed a treaty that did something almost unheard of. It eliminated an entire class of weapons, including the very Pershing 2 missiles whose 6-minute flight time had helped cause the panic in the first place. Several historians argue about the fright of the able archer filtered through Gordievsky's warnings, and it helped push Reagan towards that turn. The closest brush with the end may have been the very thing that started the recovery. But notice how hard the full truth had to fight to reach you. The defining report on Able Archer, the report written to the president itself, as ever, sat secret for 25 years. It only became public in 2015 because researchers wasted a long freedom of information campaign, including a lawsuit, to pry it open. The government did not volunteer this. It was dragged into the light, document by document, over decades. Which brings me to the part that proves that the fight is not over. It is still alive. In November 2025, just months ago, it emerged that the United States State Department had quickly deleted the records about Able Archer from an official government history. Not reclassified them, deleted them, removed them from the public account, the very material that shows how close the world came. And we clearly need to sit with that a bit, because that is bonkers. Completely deleting from the world view an event that nearly brought the world to its end. Madness. For more than 40 years after the event, and the Cold War was long finished, somebody still decided that the full story of Able Archer 83 was too sensitive for the public record. 40 years after the event in 2015, someone in the government thought it was too big, too sensitive for us to know now. The cover-up did not end in 1983. A fresh chapter of it happened last year. So here's the bottom line stripped down. A NATO training exercise was misread by a terrified Soviet Union as the opening move of a nuclear war. Documented Tier 1. The Soviets, and probably quite understandably, armed for nuclear weapons and nuclear war in response. Documented Tier 1. The West never noticed it at the time. Documented Tier 1. A single officer's decision to stay calm may have stopped a chain reaction. Documented Tier 1. And the president was told that the risk was lower than it truly was by his own advisory board. How close we actually came is the honest open question. But that we came that close at all, by accident, with neither side wanting it, is the lesson we have to keep close to us at all times. So as ever, tell me below, was Able Archer 83 the closest thing that you know of in recent times for us to get to nuclear war, or has the myth outgrown the fact? And why do you think that somebody was still quietly deleting those records right up until 2025? As ever, if we've misrepresented or misinformed, please do let me know. I only want to get to the truth here, the closest thing we can, and then let's debate what that actually means. But for those of you that are potentially new to the channel and just seeing it for the first time, I want to be as sort of math and factual as possible here, because math doesn't lie to me. People do. And governments probably lie to me more than anyone else. Any requests for any sort of content or theories or anything, please let me know in the comments too. Still got loads of ideas and loads of different types of content to come up. The reaction series I'm really excited about. The lies that they told us, that's going to start to come out as well. Built Impossible in the Pyramids, although it's very difficult to pronounce some of these ancient languages. Someone had a go at me the other day for mispronouncing the Anunnaki. All credit to that man. I'm glad he found his time to do something constructive. I now pronounce the Anunnaki the way he wants me to. All is good. But anything you guys have to say, please leave in the comments. I do read them and I find them really interesting. I don't want to be alone. You're not alone. We can decide and decipher this together. We'll delve into as much detail that is open to us. And I'm not against filing some freedom of information requests and actions myself, because I do find the amount of secrecy that is involved in not just the UFO and ancient civilization, but modern day phenomena too. I think it's probably a little bit too soon to do the COVID stuff. YouTube is going to whip me pretty strong for that. So I think that is almost certainly going to get me banned. But there is a lot to Iran and the war that is going on with Iran and America and Israel right now. Also, I would say deep in conspiracy and differences of opinion. We'll finish this one now. It's a little bit shorter than normal. I thank you as ever for listening. It does mean a lot to me. And any comments or questions, there's 2 videos here now. Take a look at, have a look, have a read, have a listen, have a view. Let me know. And I will see you in the next episode.